You've been all over the Western Theater. Bring us through the grant campaigns in the West, and let's discuss why it's so important to not only acknowledge what's important about the Western Theater, but why we need to tell that story today.
I think the more important victories are won in the West. Obviously, the captures of full armies are accomplished in the West before moving into the Eastern Theater. The investment of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson opens up the Cumberland River and then the Tennessee River. So these avenues of commerce that the rivers provide, coupled to the railroad junctions that support them and are supported by them through Shiloh down to Corinth, the rail junction there, and then ultimately to Vicksburg, which will allow us full control of the Mississippi River and a complete army capture, are the pinnacle of dividing the South, showing that we have a cohesive army. And the victories we provide there are the things that compel Lincoln to have some courage about what's going to come, because the failures in the East are not in the balance against us, not doing a good job for that. The culmination for the fighting there is at the Battle of Chattanooga, because that's the last time that Confederate forces in the Western Theater have gone on the offensive. There's no point after that. You can really genuinely call an offensive campaign from that point forward from the Confederate forces.
So we're hoping that this has brought up some questions for some Civil War enthusiasts, and we hope that the discussion should include the Western Theater. We know that so much emotion and so many of the prominent figures of the war are tied up in the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia, fighting in the East. Those are the famous things, but the things that matter also include this campaign in the West.
There's a fallback perspective as well, that because of the proximity of the capitals of both sides, that it's looked at that the fighting to gain control of everything happens around those capitals. And the Western Theater, where there's hard fighting, just as much as in the East, is kind of put on a secondary level. And at the same time, many of these things are simultaneous. In particular, the capture of Vicksburg occurs at the same time that Meade is pushing Lee out of Gettysburg. So these things don't just happen in little vacuums separately. They're all working together. And we're not even talking about the naval actions in between, but the Navy's victories are also a contributing factor to that.
So we've been on quite a journey, and I'm going to take off my historical John Rollins hat for a moment and reintroduce to you Ken Surface.
I'm not going to stop smoking.
A presenter of Ulysses S. Grant, an accomplished historian and an amazing storyteller of not only Grant's life, but this part of the war and the important parts of the war. And I'm also joined by my friend Max Harsha, who portrays Colonel Ely Parker. And though he doesn't have as much to say in the Western Theater because of reasons that we will get to.
His star is on the rise.
His star is on the rise, and he's also been part of this experience. We did a socially distanced trip during a pandemic. We went to all of these fields. It's not too dangerous to be walking around empty fields, cackling to each other with 3
states.
people.
Right, 7 states in the middle of a pandemic.
But we learned a lot.
Got arrested
I think
for that.
this is it's been quite an interesting experience. So I'm going to ask the same 2 questions to each of you. What was the most important thing you had to do to prepare, and what was the most important or most interesting thing that you learned? So, Ken, why don't you lead us off?
Well, the Marine inside me says, make sure I have enough dry socks.
There was a lot of weather.
Right. You know, there's all these other logistical considerations just to do this are kind of like an underpinning of all the logistical study that I still need to do about Grant. Preparing for this trip was very much like Grant preparing orders. How many messages did we send across the country by email?
Yeah.
Here's the update on this. Okay, here's your final order. Here's your assembly order.
Yeah.
Sort of ideas, but we use that as a framework to go on what we're going to need, how we're going to get there, who's going to supply the means for us to do that. All of that stuff has to be in consideration too. Not that just we're going to throw on the coats and run out to Fort Donelson and stand on the ramparts, because that's the in front of the cameras. That's the glory stuff that we're going to do. It's the preparation, the study, and for all these talks that I do, and thank you for your generous assessment of that. For all these talks I do, I wish I had that bubble they put over McCoy's head where he learns how to fix Spock's brain, because all of a sudden he knows everything about how to attach a Vulcan brain to a body, and he has to operate right away or he'll forget it. So with all this other study I've done since I was 8 years old, I have a lot of the key things, but then I need to open up the books again and see somebody's name and somebody, because there are key figures. If a regiment in particular or a division commander in particular is significant to the action, I've got to remember that guy's name, because that will be part of the story.
Yeah.
So I have to keep brushing up on those things and going back through. And I'll wait for that to go by, because we can do that at this point.
Yeah.
But at every site, Donaldson, like, okay, put on the Donaldson Dome. Boom, and we go to Donaldson. Put on the Dover Hotel Dome. And boom, and then, okay, we're going to go to Shiloh. So tomorrow I'm going to be really ready for that. And we get there, and I go, duh, what was that guy's name? You know, and it's like this crushing thing. Like, it's in my head. I know this. And we each come from our own persona's point of view on what that person's contribution is, and then we can feed off of that with each other if we don't already know those interactions. And those are great moments where you have a puzzle that you're filling in these extra little pieces that may not be important to somebody who just reads about that Donaldson was a fort that was captured, but the intricacies of the personalities involved and what that does. And we talk in our whole program, we're talking strategic level. Most reenactor types we know, a lot of Civil War roundtables we talk to, those fellows do a lot of intense study on a particular regiment or a particular action at a particular battle. And they want to hear that from us. And they're a little disappointed that we're looking on that backed up grander scale of the larger action. And we look at it like, well, that's where we're coming from. Those are our personas. So those other little extra pockets of information just become more vital. And even if we don't actually use them, there's something that's innately projected through. Recruiting, they told us, you will use 10% of the knowledge you study on any given sales call about this kid wants to be this in the Marine Corps. So I study up all these different points of that MOS, and then I use 10% of that knowledge in the talk. And I really find a correlation to that. For everything I can tell you about the Vicksburg campaign, the 6 months of it, we get in front of the cameras, and you're steering me to questions that you want in your program, and I'm roaring to start talking about this little side trip here or something like that, and I have to reel myself in. Like, that's not important to the big picture right now.
So for me, I think my biggest, and you've all dealt with this, my biggest preparation is being open-minded to the West, because I like McClellan. I am willing to defend McClellan. I love a lot of I love the Crimean War. I like a lot of the textbook situations that McClellan and the Army of the Potomac went with, and all of my other Civil War impressions have a lot more buttons and a lot more insignia.
It suits
but
your European war study.
I had to be, I definitely got into my Rollins impression. We've discussed Rollins quite a bit, but you had to have that pragmatism.
It's like every other impression you do as a professional military person trained in the arts of war. Now you got this
now
attorney.
I'm this bumpkin lawyer, and I'm just here to manage people. I'm not commenting on any grand strategy. So I had to unlearn that. I had to delve deep into the Western theater, but it was a lot of destroying preconceptions, and I hope that anyone watching this, it has prompted that discussion, because I might have been a person that left an angry comment, just supporting the Army of the Potomac in a video about why the Western theater is the best theater. Until now. Parker / Max, and Max is just like real Parker in this point in the war. Max is an up and coming living historian, and he has both 18th and 19th century Native American impressions, and I appreciate all the work that
and already
you're putting in, to tell those stories that have yet to be told. So, what preparation did you have to do that stood out to you for this?
Well, to start with, really, getting into this impression was first given to me by Ken, because he comes up to me at one event in which I'd asked, how do I get into the Civil War and doing reenactments, he says, well, you look like a gentleman who'd be on my staff. And unknowingly get dragged into this whole new experience of
Look at the world we made.
right. But it's been amazing ever since. And in being a new member to this, it was somewhat daunting to be next to both of you with the amount of knowledge that both of you have, and really an inspiration as well to kind of get myself to that same level. Because if I were to do a trip, just as the trip that we had just finished here, I have to know as much as you guys do, and I tried to strive for that amount of knowledge, and as close as I could get right now, especially only being about maybe a year and a half into this, I'm hoping I got what I needed to get done, and have accomplished what I needed to do.
Oh, yeah.
But definitely, and in future reference too, I will be going farther and farther with this. So in learning about everything that we got to experience, and as I'd mentioned actually on this trip to them, as we've been going from battlefield to battlefield, is that when now that I've seen the actual land that they have fought on, when I read about it, will give me a whole new light to when I see it. Because when I start reading about it, I will remember, well, that's where we were. We were standing right there. That's right. We were in this location. And for me, because I'm a very visual person, so for me, I'm going to be able to recognize exactly what that means. And when I go back, when we do another trip like this and go around with even more knowledge than what we had already, and I'm just going to be able to recognize exactly where we are, what we're doing here, why we're here, all of that stuff. And that's all because I got to first experience it with these two fine gentlemen here.
So I'll also mention that you got into a very odd niche, because there are living historians, there are reenactors, and a lot of reenactors are out there to burn powder. That's their hobby.
Who hasn't been out there for that?
There are a lot of great reenactors and living historians that do so much for their impression. I am so impressed with so many people out there doing amazing impressions. But living history presenters, we become that person, and we're not only presenting in reenactment type situations, but we're also in person talking to groups.
Right. So the trick is
like a Civil War round.
How would that person himself be able to express those things as them instead of talking about the guy doing those things? We have to be the guy.
You're not just interpreting; you are, becoming that.
Like you can't talk about, well, my personality is this. You have to project that personality because nobody talks that way about themselves.
And there's a lot of deep research to that. It's not just finding the birthdays and what battles you were at. It's reading their letters.
Bill Peck said it best.
With Know the Man.
Yeah, that was his greatest advice he gave. Bill Peck, probably the greatest Lincoln, at least on the West Coast, if you want to look at Jim Getty and Bill Peck. And his advice was that you get to know the man, and he says know his family, down to what the pets' names are and his children's birthdays, and he said the rest will come because you can recite battle names and dates and things. But when somebody asks you what your third son's favorite animal is or his favorite song, how are you that person anymore? Because we can say that about our real lives, but to make that believable.
And it's great to be able to interact with other presenters like that, where we've all asked questions that we didn't know.
Yeah.
Obviously I should know the month that my wife died. That Rollins' first wife died. And then I learned that it's in August of '61. So it's these are all important things.
And to Max's credit, the depth, he just headlong right into everything about Parker. So we talk about that at Huntington Beach. The next year I come back from what I do in Pennsylvania in the East to Huntington Beach. He comes up and it's just this information just pouring out of him. All I learned about Parker the whole year through. It's like just, whoa, stop. I can't absorb it all. And I'm just so blown away that you just embraced it like that and just took it to the ground. That you're calling up stuff that I've neglected or taken for granted about the relationship between them, that you've actually been able to educate me on those things. And I'll say something completely farcical because I've always thought it's that way. And he comes along, actually, I wasn't a lawyer. Because, Parker's one of the lawyers and Rollins is another lawyer. I've said that for months and months at talks I do. And now I got to go back and say, no, I won't say it again, but I'll be like, yeah, Parker was doing whatever he was doing, and I'll know better about what it is because of that.
Right. And in certain cases, too, there were when I was studying a lot of this stuff, because Parker, and in the very few books that are actually mentioning his name, there is also very little about what Parker did during the Civil War, because that's not what Parker was all about. As big a part as Parker actually had in the Civil War, being under Grant's staff, being his personal secretary, doing most of the letter writing, if not almost all of the
Squaring Lee away.
right, right, with any of this kind of stuff here, it was difficult for me to also try and link it back to a lot of the things that we're doing here, because there was a bigger picture on Parker's end that isn't really talked about during the Civil War, and that's the Native perspective on involvement in the Civil War, because it's not just about the slavery or about the Union versus the Confederacy, but there are also other parts that are involved in this greater scheme of a war. And the Native American side also has a fairly significant part in that. Parker just happens to be at the forefront of that. And that's where I'm trying to extend everybody else's knowledge that is around me, whether it's the public or other fellow presenters, but also to expand my knowledge of Native American heritage and understanding throughout the years, and also how we've gotten to the point to where we are now. And that's always where I try and bring it back to, is how everything that has happened through Native history, whether it's through the North, the South, East, West, whatever side of the country we are part of, that Native perspective has not changed between most of the tribes, and that it can relate to a lot of different things. And even just as simple as a small world saying that we are all Americans to Robert E. Lee at the surrender means so much more, because that was ingrained in Parker early on in his younger years, that made him just say something as impelling and as simple at one of the ends of the Civil War that culminates and sums up basically what the end of the war should mean.
And that's at your heart. That's at Parker's heart of what he truly believes. So it's not something he even has to force to like kind of rub it on Lee already. Right. It's just matter of factly. As anybody of faith would be sure in their faith of their religion, they're sure of it when they say it. So when Parker says it, it's just coming earnestly from him.
So the last question: what's the most important thing you learned? You want to lead us? The most important thing you learned on this trip down south for the war in the West.
I think the most important part that I've gotten so far out of this whole trip here is to, like we've talked about, is to spend just that little bit more time to get those fine details in on who that man is, who his family was, what his horses' names are, those kinds of very small, as insignificant as details may be, those details, because you would think bigger picture, what was his birthday, what was his military entry date, all those things, those are great to know because those are the most significant, but you got to know also the personal lives of each of them. And that's something that I've been working towards, is making sure I get that knowledge, and definitely knowing other members' personal lives as well, knowing who Grant's family is and knowing each of their members.
And when you have that, it changes how you act.
Right. It changes how you think of both your own character, and then also how you would communicate with other people, because that gives you that step up.
I think that helps people understand.
How much the whole time you've been out here, how many just stupid anecdotes from my own life I've shared with you, so like goofy things from high school days or goofy things I did in the Marine Corps, and I could pinpoint like the year it happened and where it went around it. In our personas, those become important things that you tie into. 1854, I'd just gotten out of the Army, right? So I know that, but then I also know that Jefferson Davis became Secretary of War. I also know that Lee was superintendent at West Point. So it becomes the same year that I left the Army, this happens. And all those events like that. My daughter is born on this day, and something else happened that day. It adds to the believability that you're referencing events around it and coupling that to the other events we want to tell the people about.
And it would explain too, like some of the decisions, like major decisions that are made even just during the war, can also be explained through some of those little actions. Those little actions that have happened prior that gave you an identity or an idea on how to react to a certain situation that you've come up to in a major way. Mm-hmm. So whether it was a certain battle decision that you've made, or even the fact that when Parker, like we were talking earlier, where you were sharing, General Grant's sharing letters between the general staff.
Yeah.
He's not just sharing them because that's the group in which he shares the letters with, but also to find suggestions, to understand what's the next step. Because,
Right, there's a purpose behind
Right.
it. Yeah, yeah.
So there's
And the procedure is unique. Because if we were to sit with others in our camp and somebody came up with a letter like that, it should be understood. If I want to make it like we're here with other people we don't want them to know, and what Grant would do in that case was not read the letter to everybody present, but he would pass it to the chain of command, and then everybody in the chain of command would know when they're to receive that letter, because that's the nature of it. That we just do that. That's our normal thing to do, and it would happen every time.
So for things that were important that I learned, I have two completely different categories. I'm going to mention them both. One of them is the terrain. And I honestly, unless you're up on Lookout Mountain, I can't even, you can't even explain that.
Yeah,
it
you were
is
significantly
surreal.
affected by that.
It's
Yeah,
surreal
there was
how,
no doubt.
how steep everything is,
Mhm.
and yet you have guns up there, and
Right.
yet you're able to command that whole area. The same thing with Vicksburg.
Yeah.
It is just absolutely commanding heights. They're so impressive, and you can't even begin to put that on paper. Now, the other thing that I'll mention that I thought was interesting, and it's going to be a whole other discussion, so we won't get too deep into it today, but the monuments. The memory of the Western Theater is different. There are more regimental markers.
Yeah.
There's a lot less emotion tied up in it. And in contrast to Gettysburg, Gettysburg is just a monument to the narrative that we've created for the Civil War. It's
There's a lot of individual monuments.
yeah,
Yeah, a lot more, I should say, than at the fields in the West.
but there's not a lot at Shiloh in comparison. Vicksburg, the monuments feel different. There's a lot of general markers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of smaller regimental markers, but it's not nearly as dotted as Gettysburg, and I think that's a discussion for a different day. So I will leave it at that. But it highlights the fact that people don't talk about the Western Theater,
Right.
even when even in the 19th century, the Western Theater is downplayed.
Maybe that's a characteristic of Midwesterners, that they're not so superfluous. They will talk about an incident and then leave it, and that's a personal characteristic of Grant.
Maybe.
He doesn't talk about himself. Midwesterners talk about an action, and not so much what I felt from all that. It's the action itself.
Yeah. So maybe an Indiana monument might be a bit different than the Pennsylvania monument at Gettysburg. So what was the most important thing you took away from this? Because you live your life as Grant.
Yeah.
So what did you take away from this?
Fairest thing to say is I still have a lot to learn. For everything, for all the things I know, and the things I retain, vice the things I put the bubble on to remember. There's still a lot to learn. The logistics portions of these things, and that's recurring in the Virginia trek too. Another story to be told, but. Understanding the terrain is one thing. I mean, I've created these terrain maps that I use in my program, so I've got a grasp of that. But getting more in depth with the interactions of the Navy, understanding of how the Navy functions, so that you know, from Grant's point of view as the master logistics man, he knows how the Army works that way. If I had a deeper understanding of that, because it's just perplexing, the numbers involved. So that just means I have to really get knuckled down on that part of Grant, and I know the family stuff. Okay, great. I know his friends. So I need to get into that more, so I can talk with more authority on, if you wanted me to write up what the Army's going to need for 3 days, I would love to get to that point that I can understand, well, if a horse eats this much, a man eats that much, and how many wagons carry it, we're going to need this. And I strive for that. And relieved that it was on a strategic level, and you weren't going to ask me, so how many wagons were in that, because you had mentioned something in one of the questions about when we go, like at Shiloh, we went from a 5-division mentality to, we actually established a corps system from that, and you said, so then is each corps responsible for its own logistics? And well, I don't know that.
Well.
Don't put me on the spot on that one. So you start to wonder, and we have to find that out. I mean, at least I do, because that's going to be part of what I described from there.
So if anything, this has been a a wonderful research trip for everyone.
Yeah.
I hope it does prompt a lot of discussion. We're not trying to sully the name of everyone in the Army of the Potomac, but I really I hope it for anyone still watching, if you're interested in the American Civil War, I hope this forces you to research a little bit more and go down into those
Keep an
those
open
unanswered
mind.
questions.
Keep an open mind about it, and if you want to compare it to the East, but understand it's an equal partner in the success of everything. It's not a secondary or lesser thing.
So I think we'll leave it at the war was won in the West.
Absolutely.
Okay, check if you can hear